This is ASC Ability Production, an audiobook made for myself and others who share many of the same thoughts, beliefs, or opinions, promoting growth and appealing for profound change. Introduction. This book is not about crime alone, nor about poverty alone, nor about psychology alone. It is about the slow and quiet construction of moral frameworks inside human beings who grow up under economic pressure. When wealth becomes uncertain, when work becomes unstable, and when dignity becomes conditional, the human mind begins to reorganize itself around survival. Economic decay rarely appears as a dramatic collapse at first. Instead, it appears in smaller ways. Wages stagnate. Housing becomes unreachable. Work becomes temporary. Communities fragment. Families carry stress across generations. Under these conditions, the moral reasoning of individuals begins to shift. The child raised in abundance learns patience, delayed reward, and long-term thinking. The child raised in scarcity often learns urgency, suspicion, and defensive pride. Neither is inherently immoral, but both reflect the conditions that shape them. Human thought is not formed in isolation. It develops within families, neighborhoods, institutions, and markets. When economic pressure rises, the nervous system adapts. Stress hormones remain elevated. The body carries a growing allostatic load, the biological weight produced by chronic pressure. Over time, this pressure influences judgment, trust, and emotional control. The philosophers and scholars who guide this discussion, Thomas Sowell, William James, Sigmund Freud, Erik Erikson, Lawrence Kohlberg, John Bowlby, Drusilla Dunn G. Houston, Francis Cress Welsing, and René Descartes, approach the human condition from different angles. Some examine morality, some identity, some reason, and some the historical structures shaping collective life. Yet they converge on a shared insight: human behavior cannot be separated from the environments that cultivate it. What follows is an exploration of how scarcity reshapes the moral imagination of men who grow up surrounded by unequal power, unstable opportunity, and constant comparison.
I've watched the world sort souls by flag and faith, like fate was drawn in slanted sand instead of planted seed. Some call it fairness while standing still in comfort, too afraid to touch the truth and name the bitter seed. I hear the silence bloom from fear, from shallow rooms and borrowed scripts, where thought grows faint and hearts recede.
Yeah, I moved through borders built before my name was spoken, where echo chambers chant like priests above a buried seed. They call me cynical for seeing the rigged design, but I seen self-denial dress as peace while whole lives bleed. What they refuse to face is this: groupthink keeps the garden neat, but only truth can break the concrete and free the seed.
So they shrink their side and trade their souls for safety, letting deeper thought recede. Trying to decipher humanity before my own heart hardens into stone and forgets the need for seed.
Chapter 1. The economy of the mind. The first economy any human being encounters is not money. It is attention, trust, and emotional safety. A child enters the world dependent on caregivers. The infant does not yet understand currency or markets, but it already experiences stability or instability. If protection is reliable, the nervous system learns calm. If protection is uncertain, the body learns vigilance. This early emotional economy becomes the foundation for later behavior. The young mind organizes itself around patterns. It learns who can be trusted, who cannot, and whether effort leads to reward. John Bowlby observed that attachment patterns formed in early life influence how individuals approach relationships, authority, and risk. The child who experiences reliable care often develops a sense that the world is navigable. The child who experiences neglect or unpredictability often develops a defensive posture toward life. Economic scarcity intensifies these early lessons. When families live under financial stress, arguments increase, patience decreases, and emotional resources become limited. Parents working multiple jobs may love their children deeply, yet the structure of their lives leaves little time for emotional availability. The child perceives this absence not as economic necessity but as emotional distance. Over time, the developing brain adapts to this environment. Neural circuits associated with fear and vigilance become more active. Stress hormones remain elevated. The body begins carrying the invisible burden known as allostatic load. This biological pressure influences decision making. It shortens time horizons. Long-term planning becomes difficult when daily survival consumes attention. William James once argued that the mind follows habits formed through repeated experience. If a person repeatedly experiences instability, the mind gradually assumes instability is normal. Expectations shrink. Risk tolerance changes. Under these conditions, young men growing up in environments of economic decay often develop what might be described as defensive morality. This morality is not necessarily evil or malicious. It is pragmatic. Loyalty becomes limited to small circles. Suspicion toward institutions increases. Authority becomes something to resist rather than trust. The neighborhood becomes a classroom. Within this classroom, boys observe who commands respect and who does not. They notice which behaviors produce status. In communities experiencing social stratification and limited mobility, formal institutions like schools may appear disconnected from real opportunity. The informal economy of reputation replaces the formal economy of credentials. Young men begin measuring themselves through visible markers of dominance, charisma, or survival skill. In these environments, insults carry weight because dignity is scarce. Respect becomes a currency. Psychologists describe the early stage of learning about one's own limitations as conscious incompetence. It is the uncomfortable moment when a person realizes they do not yet possess the skills needed to succeed. In stable environments, this realization encourages growth. In unstable environments, this realization can produce humiliation. Humiliation is dangerous when combined with scarcity. It often produces anger rather than curiosity. Freud argued that human beings manage internal conflict through defense mechanisms. When the ego feels threatened, the mind protects itself through denial, projection, or rationalization. A young man who feels powerless may begin interpreting criticism as hostility. Mockery becomes unbearable because it reinforces internal doubt. This fragile state is often described as narcissistic vulnerability, a condition where self-worth appears confident on the surface but remains fragile underneath. Economic pressure amplifies this fragility. The young man begins searching for explanations for his struggles. Some explanations are accurate. Structural inequality exists. Opportunity is unevenly distributed. Historical patterns of exclusion have shaped the modern world. Yet the search for explanation often occurs inside echo chamber participant communities where simplified narratives circulate repeatedly. Inside these spaces, frustration becomes ideology. Group discussions reward certainty. Doubt becomes weakness. This environment encourages herd mentality and groupthink, where agreement matters more than truth. René Descartes once insisted that clear thinking requires disciplined doubt. But doubt is difficult in environments where survival depends on belonging. Belonging offers psychological safety. When economic systems weaken traditional wealth building strategies, stable employment, home ownership, predictable careers, the search for identity intensifies. Individuals begin organizing themselves around tribe, ideology, or resentment. Historical thinkers like Drusilla Dunn G. Houston and Frances Cress Welsing explored how narratives about power, identity, and historical struggles shape collective consciousness. Whether these narratives emphasize oppression, resilience, or competition, they influence how individuals interpret their own position in society. A young man growing up under scarcity does not merely ask how to succeed. He asks whether success is even possible. If he concludes the system is rigged beyond repair, motivation declines. This is where cognitive stagnation can emerge. The mind stops searching for new strategies and instead repeats familiar frustrations. The philosopher Thomas Sowell frequently emphasized that incentives shape behavior. If the perceived reward for long-term discipline appears unreachable, people rationally shift toward short-term gains. This shift explains why some individuals prioritize immediate respect, immediate pleasure, or immediate income even when those choices carry long-term risk. The body and mind are adapting to the environment they perceive. At this stage, another concept becomes important: vincible ignorance. This phrase refers to ignorance that could be overcome if an individual actively pursued better understanding. But the pursuit of knowledge requires psychological space. When stress dominates daily life, reflection becomes a luxury. The young man becomes trapped between two competing pressures. One pressure demands survival within a difficult environment. The other pressure demands personal responsibility and long-term discipline. Both pressures are real. And inside this tension, the central confession of this book begins to take shape. One cannot easily think, act, or feel properly without financial independence. Scarcity erodes patience. It distorts perception. It transforms ordinary disagreements into personal threats. It magnifies humiliation and amplifies resentment. The mind becomes a battlefield where pride fights despair. This is where the story of Scarcity's children truly begins. The same young man who learns early that stability is fragile begins to construct a personal philosophy about the world long before he is able to articulate it. His philosophy is rarely written down, but it lives in the way he walks, the way he listens, and the way he interprets silence from others. It develops quietly through observation. He watches who is respected and who is ignored. He observes how money changes the tone of conversations. He notices that people with financial security speak about patience and discipline differently than those who struggle to pay rent. Gradually, the idea begins to form that the mind itself is part of the economy. Thoughts are shaped by conditions just as markets are shaped by incentives. A person raised in abundance learns to see time as an ally. A person raised in scarcity often learns to see time as an enemy. Waiting becomes dangerous when the future looks uncertain. The nervous system begins to mirror these expectations. The constant tension of instability produces an elevated allostatic load. This pressure does not simply affect the body but also attention, memory, and judgment. Small setbacks feel catastrophic because they arrive on top of accumulated strain. A delayed paycheck, an insult from a stranger, or rejection from an employer becomes more than a momentary disappointment. It becomes evidence that the system itself is hostile. This perception gradually influences identity. Erik Erikson described human development as a series of stages where individuals struggle to form a stable sense of self. During adolescence, the central question becomes identity versus confusion. When a young man grows up in an environment where opportunity feels restricted and social stratification appears immovable, identity can become entangled with resistance. He may begin defining himself through opposition rather than aspiration. Instead of asking what kind of life he wants to build, he begins asking who is responsible for the obstacles in front of him. The search for explanation is natural, but the sources of explanation matter. Many individuals find themselves inside communities of echo chamber participant discussions where grievances circulate endlessly. Within these spaces, certainty becomes intoxicating. Complex realities are simplified into narratives of enemies and allies. The conversation rewards emotional intensity rather than careful analysis. Doubt becomes uncomfortable because doubt threatens belonging. Over time, the group reinforces its own assumptions until the collective voice grows louder than individual reflection. This environment encourages herd mentality and groupthink. Once a narrative becomes dominant, members repeat it without examining its accuracy. The repetition itself creates a sense of truth. The mind begins accepting familiarity as evidence. What is repeated most often begins to feel most convincing. René Descartes warned centuries ago that the mind must learn to question its own assumptions. Yet questioning requires calm, and calm requires security. When daily life feels unstable, mental energy shifts toward protection rather than investigation. At the same time, another psychological tension begins to appear. The young man becomes aware of his own limitations. He sees others advancing in education or career while he struggles to maintain momentum. This moment of realization is conscious incompetence, the painful awareness that one does not yet possess the skills necessary to succeed. In supportive environments, this stage becomes the beginning of growth. Teachers, mentors, and stable institutions provide guidance. Mistakes become lessons rather than humiliation. But in environments shaped by economic decay, the same realization can produce shame. Shame is rarely discussed openly among men. Instead, it hides behind sarcasm, aggression, or indifference. The young man learns to mask vulnerability because vulnerability invites ridicule. Over time, the mask becomes a permanent expression. Confidence appears outwardly strong while internally the individual carries what psychologists describe as narcissistic vulnerability. This fragile confidence depends heavily on external validation. Respect from peers becomes essential. Public embarrassment becomes unbearable. Social interactions begin to resemble negotiations of status rather than opportunities for connection. The surrounding culture reinforces this mindset. Social media, entertainment, and advertising constantly broadcast images of wealth and success. These images rarely show the long years of discipline behind achievement. Instead, they highlight the final outcome. The result is a distorted comparison between one's current life and someone else's highlight. Behavioral researchers have long observed that human beings are deeply sensitive to relative status. People do not simply measure success through absolute income or stability. They measure it by comparison with those around them. In communities experiencing economic strain, these comparisons become intense. A young man may see peers gaining recognition through risky or dramatic actions. Reputation becomes a faster route to status than slow institutional advancement. The informal economy of respect begins overshadowing the formal economy of education. This shift creates moral confusion. Lawrence Kohlberg argued that moral reasoning evolves through stages, moving from obedience to authority toward principled thinking. Yet moral development depends on environments that reward fairness and consistency. When institutions appear corrupt or indifferent, the authority stage collapses. The young man stops believing that rules serve a meaningful purpose. Rules become obstacles rather than guidance. The result is not necessarily deliberate criminality. Often it begins as rational adaptation. If long-term pathways appear blocked, individuals pursue strategies that provide immediate advantage. Quick money, symbolic power, or social dominance can appear more realistic than distant promises of stability. Thomas Sowell often argued that incentives determine behavior more reliably than intentions. When systems reward short-term gain and punish patience, people adapt accordingly. The young man may still desire a respectable life, yet his daily decisions reflect the environment around him. At this stage, another barrier appears: vincible ignorance. Information that could improve one's understanding remains available but unused. The mind avoids complex analysis because complex analysis threatens comfortable narratives. Learning requires admitting previous mistakes, and that admission can feel like surrender. Cognitive stagnation slowly settles in. The same explanations repeat themselves without producing progress. The individual circles the same frustrations year after year. Each disappointment reinforces the belief that nothing can change. Meanwhile, the body continues carrying the stress of survival. Sleep becomes irregular. If a man wishes to understand the instincts that scarcity awakens inside him, he can look toward the habits of predators that survive not by abundance, but by precision. Two animals illustrate this tension better than most: the hawk and the lion. They live in different landscapes and hunt with different strategies, yet both reveal something about how survival shapes perception. The hawk survives through height and patience. It circles the sky with slow wings, observing the ground with extraordinary focus. It wastes little energy chasing every movement. Instead, it waits for the moment when opportunity reveals itself. The hawk's power comes from perspective. From above, it sees patterns invisible to creatures trapped in the grass. The lion survives differently. The lion lives within the terrain itself. It moves through dust, heat, and uncertainty. Its survival depends on cooperation, dominance, and bursts of strength. The lion must defend territory, negotiate status within the pride, and respond quickly when threats appear. These two survival strategies resemble two psychological responses to scarcity. Some individuals attempt to live like hawks. They seek distance from immediate chaos. They study patterns. They try to understand incentives and structures before acting. Their ambition is not simply to survive but to rise above the confusion of the environment. They train their perception to recognize opportunities others overlook. Others live like lions. Their environment does not allow them to withdraw and observe from a distance. Every day demands action. Territory must be defended. Respect must be negotiated. Survival depends on visible strength and rapid responses to challenges. Neither strategy is inherently superior. Both are shaped by circumstances. Yet scarcity tends to push young men toward the lion's path. When daily life demands constant reaction, there is little space for the hawk's altitude. The mind becomes accustomed to immediate threats and immediate solutions. This is where the biological pressure of allostatic load quietly alters judgment. The body under constant strain seeks quick resolution to tension. Long observation feels uncomfortable because the nervous system remains prepared for conflict. The lion inside the man begins responding to every insult as a territorial challenge. A remark from a stranger becomes a test of dominance. A disagreement becomes a contest of pride. In communities where respect is scarce, every interaction begins resembling a negotiation of status. This psychological terrain produces a dangerous loop. The more the individual behaves defensively, the more others interpret his behavior as hostility. Suspicion spreads quietly through social networks. Soon the environment begins reflecting the very aggression the individual fears. This is where narcissistic vulnerability becomes visible. The lion projects confidence, but underneath the roar lies a constant fear of humiliation. The lion cannot afford to appear weak because weakness invites attack. Yet the hawk reveals another possibility. The hawk does not fight every creature it encounters. It conserves energy. It understands that survival depends not only on strength but also on timing. It observes the terrain until the correct moment appears. Thomas Sowell once emphasized that wisdom often lies in recognizing trade-offs rather than chasing perfect solutions. The hawk embodies this principle. It does not waste effort on battles that offer little reward. The lion, by contrast, must respond to immediate challenges within the pride and the territory. The lion's environment forces constant negotiation with rivals. Strength becomes the language through which stability is maintained. Human societies create similar pressures. In neighborhoods where economic decline erodes institutions, individuals begin forming informal systems of order. Respect replaces law as the primary regulator of behavior. The young man learns quickly that reputation travels faster than truth. One moment of perceived weakness can follow him for years. Stories circulate through communities like echoes bouncing off walls. Inside these echo chamber participant circles, narratives become exaggerated. One story becomes 10 stories. One insult becomes proof of betrayal. The group begins reinforcing the same interpretation repeatedly until it hardens into certainty. This process encourages herd mentality. The group moves together emotionally, amplifying anger or pride without questioning the direction. Groupthink begins shaping decisions that individuals might never make alone. The hawk's solitude protects it from this pressure. Alone in the sky, it must rely on its own perception. It cannot afford illusions because illusions cost energy. The lion rarely has this luxury. The lion lives inside social hierarchy. It must maintain alliances and defend status. The pride's opinion carries weight. Young men growing up under economic pressure often move between these two instincts without realizing it. Sometimes they attempt the hawk's distance, withdrawing into observation and reflection. Other times they embody the lion, confronting the world directly through strength and defiance. Erik Erikson would describe this tension as part of the struggle to construct identity. The individual experiments with different roles, testing which one provides stability. Yet scarcity complicates this process because the environment rarely offers clear feedback. A man may work diligently yet remain financially unstable. Another man may achieve quick success through riskier paths. The environment appears inconsistent. This inconsistency breeds cognitive stagnation. When cause and effect become unclear, motivation weakens. The mind begins repeating familiar strategies rather than experimenting with new ones. Freud believed the human psyche constantly negotiates between impulse, reality, and moral restraint. Scarcity intensifies this negotiation. Impulses grow stronger when the future appears uncertain. The voice of restraint weakens when long-term rewards appear unreachable. Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning depend heavily on exposure to fair systems. When systems appear unfair, individuals often retreat to simpler moral codes based on loyalty or retaliation. The lion's morality revolves around territory and protection. The hawk's morality revolves around calculation and survival. The human mind contains both. A man living under economic decay begins to feel that the ground itself is unstable. Traditional wealth-building strategies, steady employment, predictable careers, gradual accumulation, begin to disappear or transform into fragile promises. Commercialization spreads into every corner of life. Labor becomes transactional. Socialization becomes competitive. Migration becomes a gamble. Everything becomes commodified. Friendship becomes networking. Identity becomes branding. Even attention becomes currency.
I've watched the world sort souls by flag and faith. Like fate was drawn in slanted sand instead of planted seed. Some call it fairness while standing still in comfort. Too afraid to touch the truth and name the bitter seed. I hear the silence bloom from fear, from shallow rooms and borrowed scripts, where thought grows faint and hearts receive.
Yeah, I moved through borders built before my name was spoken, where echo chambers chant like priests above a buried seed. They call me cynical for seeing the rigged design, but I seen self-denial dress as peace while whole lives bleed. What they refuse to face is this: groupthink keeps the garden neat, but only truth can break the concrete and free the seed.
Pretend our chance, yet
This is ASC Ability Production, an audiobook made for myself and others who share many of the same thoughts, beliefs, or opinions, promoting growth and appealing for profound change.
I keep asking who is safe, which heart is living land, while my lonely thoughts keep rooting like a hidden seed. When no one shares care or love, my wants turn wild and slant, and every silence feeds the hunger like a reckless seed.
I wanted love, approval, a place to stand but neglect. Let something wicked germinate like a buried seed. Now love, suspicion, cravings, and defeat all branch through my chest, and I can feel my old compassion recede like a dying seed. The joy I had got stripped to cynicism, sarcasm, and self-absorption. I'm trying to read my ruin like cracked earth, searching for a seed.
Chapter 2. The Inheritance of Scarcity. Scarcity is rarely born in a single generation. It travels quietly through families, neighborhoods, and institutions like an inheritance that nobody consciously asked for. Money can be inherited, but so can stress, fear, and expectation. The child of scarcity does not only inherit a financial condition, he inherits a psychological atmosphere. A boy raised in economic stability often inherits patience. The household language encourages planning. Conversations revolve around long-term investments, education, and gradual progress. Time is treated like a resource that expands rather than collapses. The boy raised in scarcity inherits something different. He inherits urgency. Urgency shapes perception. When resources appear limited, every opportunity feels fragile. Every mistake feels dangerous. The young mind begins developing defensive habits before it fully understands the rules of the larger world. This inheritance is not simply emotional. The body carries it as well. Chronic stress within families builds what researchers call allostatic load, the biological wear that accumulates when the nervous system remains in a prolonged state of vigilance. The child watches adults navigate debt, unemployment, humiliation, and disappointment. Even when nothing violent occurs, the atmosphere itself teaches the body that life requires constant readiness. Over time, these lessons form the early architecture of identity. Erik Erikson observed that adolescence is the period when individuals struggle to answer a fundamental question: who am I in relation to the world around me? Yet the child of scarcity often answers this question within the shadow of social stratification. He already senses that society is layered. Some doors appear open while others feel permanently closed. These perceptions influence ambition. The young man might dream of advancement, yet he simultaneously carries doubt about whether advancement is realistic. This doubt becomes a quiet psychological barrier. It does not always destroy motivation, but it complicates it. Thomas Sowell argued that incentives shape the direction of human effort. When institutions reward long-term discipline with visible mobility, people invest in patience. When institutions appear disconnected from real opportunity, individuals search for alternative paths. Some of these paths are constructive. Others are destructive. Many are simply pragmatic responses to unstable environments. Inside communities experiencing economic strain, young men quickly learn that reputation travels faster than credentials. Respect becomes a form of currency. This environment encourages displays of strength, confidence, and defiance. Yet beneath these displays lies a deeper psychological tension. Freud described how individuals develop defense mechanisms to protect themselves from uncomfortable truths. A young man experiencing conscious incompetence may realize that he lacks certain skills or advantages needed for upward mobility. Instead of confronting that realization directly, the mind may reinterpret the problem. Failure becomes the system's fault, or the world's corruption, or the betrayal of institutions. Sometimes these explanations contain genuine truth. Structural barriers exist. History shapes opportunity. Yet explanations can also become shields against reflection. This is where vincible ignorance quietly emerges. Information that could expand understanding remains within reach, but emotional resistance prevents engagement. Learning requires humility, and humility feels dangerous when pride is the final defense against humiliation. Within peer groups, the situation becomes even more complex. Conversations often unfold inside echo chamber participant circles where frustration repeats itself until it begins sounding like certainty. Herd mentality develops gradually as individuals reinforce each other's interpretations. Groupthink simplifies reality. Nuanced discussion fades. The world becomes divided between villains and victims, winners and losers, insiders and outsiders. The young man begins viewing society through increasingly rigid categories. Identity becomes less about curiosity and more about allegiance. Frances Cress Welsing and Drusilla Dunn G. Houston both explored how historical narratives shape the consciousness of communities. Whether these narratives emphasize resilience, conflict, or survival, they influence how individuals interpret their place in the social hierarchy. For the child of scarcity, these narratives often become tools for emotional orientation. They explain suffering, define enemies, and offer collective meaning. Yet they can also intensify resentment if they leave no room for personal agency. William James believed that belief itself shapes experience. If a person believes effort is meaningless, effort collapses. If a person believes opportunity exists somewhere beyond the visible horizon, the mind begins searching for pathways. The inheritance of scarcity therefore includes a battle between two psychological voices. One voice whispers that the world is permanently closed. The other whispers that the world is complex but navigable. Between those voices stands the developing man, carrying the emotional weight of history, family pressure, pride, insecurity, and the silent fear of becoming irrelevant. This is the inheritance he must confront before he can decide whether scarcity will remain his identity or simply the environment from which he began. The inheritance of scarcity is not only visible in economics or family dynamics. It is also visible in the symbolic stories that societies tell about humiliation, power, and moral endurance. One of the clearest illustrations appears in an ancient scene recorded in Matthew 27:27, 31 and Mark 15:16, 20. In these passages a man stands surrounded by soldiers who hold absolute authority over him. They dress him in a scarlet robe, place a crown of thorns upon his head, kneel before him in mock reverence, and strike him while shouting sarcastic praise. The ritual is not simply violence. It is humiliation performed as spectacle. The soldiers understand something about power. Dominance is not only maintained through physical control but through the manipulation of dignity. When a man's identity is publicly ridiculed, the crowd learns who holds authority and who does not. Scenes like this reveal how humiliation operates within human psychology. A man who is stripped of dignity before witnesses experiences something deeper than physical pain. His sense of self becomes contested territory. Pride, shame, anger, and fear collide within the mind. The nervous system absorbs the message that social status can be destroyed publicly and instantly. Many young men growing up under scarcity recognize this dynamic even if their circumstances are different. Mockery, ridicule, and public embarrassment carry enormous weight in environments where respect is scarce. The fear of humiliation becomes a powerful motivator of behavior. In the biblical scene, the soldiers laugh as they bow in false reverence, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." The performance reveals how easily symbols can be twisted into tools of domination. Authority can disguise cruelty behind ceremony. Social life often mirrors this pattern in quieter ways. In neighborhoods shaped by social stratification, people become highly sensitive to signs of disrespect. A sarcastic remark, a dismissive gesture, or a rumor spreading through the community can feel like the modern equivalent of a crown of thorns placed upon one's identity. The young man observing these dynamics learns quickly that humiliation travels faster than truth. Reputation moves through conversations like wind through dry grass. One moment of weakness can echo through an entire social network. This pressure intensifies narcissistic vulnerability. The individual begins guarding his pride carefully because pride becomes the final shield protecting him from public disgrace. Confidence becomes performative. Strength becomes theatrical. Yet the biblical illustration also reveals another psychological dimension. The man being mocked remains silent for much of the ordeal. He does not retaliate against the soldiers even though the injustice is clear. His restraint illustrates a different type of power, one rooted in internal conviction rather than external dominance. For a young man navigating scarcity, this contrast raises a difficult question. Which form of strength truly protects dignity? The explosive response of wounded pride or the controlled endurance of disciplined restraint? Freud believed human behavior often reflects the tension between impulse and restraint. The humiliation described in those scriptures would naturally provoke rage in most individuals. Yet restraint demonstrates a capacity to rise above immediate reaction. This distinction becomes critical in environments where herd mentality encourages retaliation. Within echo chamber participant circles, stories of disrespect spread quickly and often provoke collective anger. Groupthink magnifies the pressure to respond aggressively because silence can be interpreted as weakness. The young man then faces a psychological crossroads. If he retaliates, he may earn immediate respect but risk long-term consequences. If he restrains himself, he preserves control but may endure further ridicule. This dilemma reveals how moral reasoning develops under pressure. Lawrence Kohlberg suggested that higher stages of moral development require individuals to move beyond simple reward and punishment toward principles of justice and responsibility. Yet reaching those stages requires emotional stability and guidance. Scarcity complicates that journey. When the world appears unjust, patience feels naive. When humiliation is common, retaliation appears logical. Over time, these responses can solidify into cultural expectations. Boys learn that pride must be defended quickly or not at all. Yet the biblical scene quietly challenges this assumption. The soldiers possess physical power, yet their behavior reveals insecurity. They rely on spectacle and mockery to assert dominance. The man they ridicule possesses no weapons, yet his composure transforms the meaning of the encounter. History remembers the mocked man. The soldiers fade into anonymity. This reversal carries a psychological lesson about dignity. External power can humiliate the body, but it cannot permanently control the meaning a person assigns to his own suffering. For the child of scarcity, this insight is difficult but essential. Economic pressure may limit opportunity. Social structures may produce inequality. Mockery and insults may circulate endlessly through communities. Yet the individual still retains one domain of authority, the interpretation of his own experience. William James once suggested that human beings possess the ability to redirect attention and thereby reshape their internal reality. The mind can reinterpret events not only as injury but as information. Humiliation can either harden resentment or sharpen awareness. If resentment dominates, cognitive stagnation follows. The mind becomes trapped in repetitive narratives of injustice. Vincible ignorance expands because learning appears pointless. But if awareness develops, humiliation becomes a harsh teacher. The individual begins studying the structures around him more carefully. He begins asking why certain environments produce mockery while others produce mentorship. This shift resembles the movement from lion to hawk described earlier. Instead of responding immediately to every insult, the individual begins observing the terrain from a greater height. He begins recognizing patterns of power, incentives, and status. And slowly, the inheritance of scarcity begins transforming from a prison into a subject of study. Another illustration of how scarcity, humiliation, and identity crises interact can be seen in a recent news report examining youth violence in Germany. In an article published by Deutsche Welle, DW, and written by journalist Marcel Furstenau, released on November 29, 2025, authorities described a worrying pattern: increasing numbers of children and teenagers, mostly boys, becoming involved in extremist groups and violent behavior. Police in Germany have even begun paying closer attention to young people during routine checks in train stations, an indication that radicalization is appearing earlier in life than in previous decades. The report portrays a disturbing image of adolescence under social tension. The country is Germany, one of the most economically advanced nations in Europe, yet the phenomenon appears among youths who are often between early teenage years and young adulthood. Many are male, searching for belonging, identity, and recognition in online communities or tightly knit peer circles. In several cases reported in Germany, violent youth networks have been organized through closed online chats and social media channels, where acts of aggression are glorified and ideological narratives circulate rapidly. The story reveals a paradox. Economic stability at the national level does not automatically produce psychological stability at the individual level. Even in prosperous societies, young people can experience isolation, frustration, and identity confusion. When these feelings accumulate without guidance, they become fertile ground for herd mentality and groupthink. A teenage boy searching for significance may encounter digital communities promising brotherhood and purpose. Inside these spaces, he becomes an echo chamber participant, hearing the same messages repeated: that society is collapsing, that enemies are responsible for humiliation, and that violence is a legitimate expression of loyalty. The repetition creates emotional momentum. Beliefs become sharper, and doubt becomes unacceptable. Behavioral observers have long noticed that adolescence is a stage where identity is fragile. Erik Erikson described this period as the struggle between identity and role confusion. If the young man fails to find recognition through constructive roles, education, work, mentorship, he may seek recognition through defiance. This process is visible in the German cases mentioned in the report. Some youths, barely old enough to vote, begin organizing themselves around ideological hostility. Violence becomes a symbolic language through which they express belonging. The group offers certainty in a world that feels confusing. Psychologically, the mechanism resembles a young lion entering a pride that promises protection and power. The pride teaches him which enemies to fear and which rituals to follow. Once accepted, the young lion defends the pride fiercely, even if he barely understands the origins of the conflict. But unlike animals guided purely by instinct, human beings carry narratives. Historical grievances, political slogans, and cultural myths are layered upon youthful frustration. Frances Cress Welsing and Drusilla Dunn G. Houston both examined how collective stories about power and identity shape group consciousness. These stories can inspire resilience, yet they can also deepen hostility when interpreted through the lens of humiliation. The German report suggests that many of these young men feel disconnected from meaningful opportunity or recognition. When belonging is absent in ordinary social life, extremist circles offer immediate identity. The young man who once felt invisible suddenly feels seen. However, this visibility carries a cost. Participation in violent subcultures gradually replaces independent thinking with cognitive stagnation. The young participant stops evaluating evidence. Vincible ignorance grows because questioning the group threatens membership. Loyalty becomes more important than truth. Over time, the psychological structure becomes self-reinforcing. Anger generates belonging, belonging generates loyalty, and loyalty demands further anger. The young man becomes trapped in a moral universe where violence appears justified. This phenomenon is not unique to Germany. The German example simply illustrates a broader pattern appearing across many societies. When individuals experience humiliation, social fragmentation, and uncertainty about the future, extremist narratives can appear attractive because they offer simple explanations and emotional solidarity. Yet the deeper cause often lies beneath ideology. It lies in the same forces described earlier: loneliness, status anxiety, disrupted economic expectations, and the heavy psychological burden carried by young men who feel that the world is moving forward without them. Scarcity does not always mean absolute poverty. Sometimes it means a scarcity of recognition, stability, or meaning. When these forms of scarcity combine, the young mind begins searching desperately for identity. And in that search, the difference between belonging and extremism can become dangerously thin.
I keep asking who is safe, which heart is living land, while my lonely thoughts keep rooting like a hidden seed. When no one shares care or love, my wants turn wild and slant, and every silence feeds the hunger like a reckless seed.
Germinate like a buried seed. Now I love suspicion, cravings, and defeat all branch through my chest, and I can feel my old compassion recede like a dying seed. The joy I had got stripped to cynicism, sarcasm, and self-absorption. I'm trying to read my ruin like cracked earth, searching for a seed.
This is a Ability production, an audiobook made for myself and others who share many of the same thoughts, beliefs, or opinions, promoting growth and appealing for profound change.
I've watched the world sort souls by flag and faith, like fate was drawn in slanted sand instead of planted seed. Some call it fairness while standing still in comfort, too afraid to touch the truth and name the bitter seed. I hear the silence bloom from fear, from shallow rooms and borrowed scripts, where thought grows faint and hearts recede.
Yeah, I moved through borders built before my name was spoken, where echo chambers chant like priests above a buried seed. They call me cynical for seeing the rigged design, but I seen self-denial dress as peace while whole lives bleed. What they refuse to face is this: groupthink keeps the garden neat, but only truth can break the concrete and free the seed.
Pretend our chance, yet every wound was mad.
Chapter 3. The Morality Market. Morality does not develop in a vacuum. It forms within environments where actions produce consequences, where rewards follow certain behaviors and punishment follows others. In this sense, morality begins resembling a marketplace. Every society quietly signals what it values. In stable environments, patience is rewarded. Education leads to opportunity. Discipline produces visible progress. These signals teach individuals that long-term effort carries meaning. But when economic systems weaken and opportunity becomes uneven, the moral marketplace begins shifting. The connection between effort and reward becomes uncertain. When people observe hard work producing little progress while shortcuts produce rapid gains, the moral compass begins drifting. The young man growing up in scarcity senses this contradiction early. He hears speeches about integrity and perseverance, yet his daily observations reveal something different. Some individuals achieve influence through manipulation. Others gain attention through aggression. The environment appears to reward spectacle rather than substance. This contradiction creates psychological tension. Lawrence Kohlberg believed that moral reasoning evolves as individuals encounter more complex situations. At higher stages, people begin acting according to internal principles rather than external rewards. Yet reaching this stage requires consistent examples of fairness. When fairness appears absent, morality becomes transactional. A man begins asking practical questions rather than ethical ones. Instead of asking whether an action is right, he asks whether it will succeed. Survival becomes the measure of wisdom. Within peer groups, this shift becomes visible. Conversations revolve around strategy, reputation, and loyalty rather than responsibility. The group rewards behaviors that strengthen collective identity. Anyone who questions the group risks exclusion. Herd mentality quietly reshapes moral boundaries. What once felt unacceptable becomes normal once repeated frequently. Groupthink accelerates this transformation by discouraging dissent. Freud described how individuals internalize social expectations through the development of conscience. Yet the conscience itself reflects the environment that shaped it. If the surrounding culture normalizes cynicism, the conscience adapts accordingly. The result is a morality market where values fluctuate like currency. Respect becomes negotiable. Loyalty becomes conditional. Truth becomes secondary to persuasion. The young man navigating this landscape must constantly calculate which principles are safe to follow and which principles will isolate him. This calculation produces exhaustion. The mind carries two competing voices. One voice insists that dignity requires honesty, patience, and discipline. The other voice whispers that these virtues may lead only to disappointment. René Descartes argued that clear thinking requires stripping away illusions until only certainty remains. Yet, in environments shaped by social stratification and economic decay, certainty becomes difficult to locate. Every institution appears questionable. Every authority appears compromised. The individual begins trusting only his immediate circle, sometimes not even that. This is the danger of the morality market. When principles lose their stability, identity becomes vulnerable. The young man begins constructing his character through reaction rather than conviction. He mirrors whatever behavior appears most effective in the moment. Over time, this produces cognitive stagnation. Instead of developing deeper understanding, the mind repeats strategies learned from observation and imitation. But markets also reveal another truth. Even within unstable environments, individuals occasionally encounter examples of integrity that resist corruption. A teacher who refuses cynicism. A mentor who rewards discipline. A parent who maintains dignity despite hardship. These figures quietly challenge the assumption that morality must always follow the logic of scarcity. They remind the young man that while markets influence behavior, they do not completely determine it. The tension between principle and survival can be understood by observing the different lifestyles within the Panthera family. The lion, tiger, jaguar, and leopard share the same lineage, yet each survives through a distinct strategy shaped by its environment. Their differences mirror how human beings adapt their moral behavior when living under different conditions of scarcity or stability. The lion lives in a pride. Its survival depends on cooperation, hierarchy, and constant negotiation of status. Within the pride, every member knows its position. Strength, loyalty, and visible dominance regulate order. A young lion learns quickly that respect must be defended. If he appears weak, rivals challenge him. If he proves strong, the pride accepts him. This resembles the social environments where respect becomes the central currency. Young men raised in neighborhoods shaped by economic tension often behave like lions within a pride. They move through networks of peers where reputation determines safety and influence. Loyalty becomes sacred because betrayal threatens the entire structure. The morality of the pride is simple: protect the group, punish disrespect, and maintain status. The tiger lives differently. It hunts alone across large territories, relying on patience and stealth rather than collective defense. The tiger wastes little energy on unnecessary conflict. It studies the terrain carefully before striking. The tiger's strength lies in independence. Some individuals living within difficult social environments adopt a similar approach. Instead of engaging in constant contests of pride, they withdraw slightly from the crowd. They observe patterns and move strategically. Their moral framework becomes quieter and more internal. They understand that survival may depend on avoiding battles that others feel compelled to fight. The leopard represents another adaptation. It survives in landscapes where stronger predators roam nearby. The leopard hunts efficiently but quickly drags its prey into trees where competitors cannot easily reach it. This behavior reveals a subtle intelligence. The leopard does not compete directly with the lion or hyena but adjusts its strategy to survive within the same environment. Many individuals navigating social stratification behave like leopards. They recognize the dangers of open confrontation and instead pursue opportunities quietly. They protect their progress carefully because visible success can attract envy or sabotage. Their morality becomes cautious, shaped by awareness of hidden threats. Then there's the jaguar, powerful and solitary, living in dense forests and riverbanks. The jaguar possesses extraordinary strength for its size and uses an unusual hunting technique, crushing the skull of its prey with precision. It does not rely on speed alone but on accuracy. The jaguar waits for the exact moment when effort will produce decisive results. This resembles the individual who studies systems deeply before acting. Instead of reacting emotionally to every injustice, he develops strategic awareness. He learns where power truly resides and focuses his energy on those points. His moral discipline is not loud, but it is firm. These different animals reveal an important lesson about human behavior. The environment does not produce a single response to scarcity. It produces multiple strategies. Some individuals become lions, defending dignity through confrontation. Others become tigers, seeking independence from chaotic social dynamics. Some move like leopards, navigating risk quietly while protecting their progress. Others think like jaguars, studying systems carefully before acting. Yet all of them share one underlying challenge. They must maintain a moral center while living in landscapes where incentives often reward aggression, deception, or spectacle. The morality market described earlier constantly pressures individuals to compromise their principles for short-term advantage. When that pressure grows strong, herd mentality begins influencing behavior. If everyone within the pride behaves like lions fighting for status, the individual may feel forced to imitate them. Groupthink discourages alternative strategies because difference appears suspicious. But the natural world demonstrates that survival rarely belongs to only one strategy. Diversity of behavior often preserves balance. For the young man shaped by scarcity, recognizing this diversity becomes a moment of awakening. He begins understanding that he does not have to respond to every challenge in the same way as the crowd around him. He can learn when to roar like a lion, when to observe like a tiger, when to maneuver like a leopard, and when to strike with the calculated precision of a jaguar. This realization expands the boundaries of moral imagination. Instead of reacting instinctively to every insult or obstacle, the individual begins asking a different question. Not simply how to survive the environment, but how to move through it without losing the integrity that defines who he wishes to become. Over time, the young man begins noticing that the struggle around him is not only a struggle for money or status. It is also a struggle for interpretation. Every event in life demands explanation. Failure requires a reason. Success requires a story. Humiliation demands meaning. Within communities shaped by scarcity, these explanations circulate constantly. Conversations repeat familiar conclusions about the system, about society, about enemies and allies. The explanations offer emotional relief because they transform confusion into certainty. Yet certainty can become dangerous when it discourages reflection. René Descartes believed that clear thinking begins with doubt. Doubt does not mean paralysis. It means refusing to accept convenient explanations without examination. But doubt requires patience, and patience is difficult in environments where survival feels urgent. This urgency creates fertile ground for herd mentality. When individuals feel uncertain about the future, they instinctively look toward the group for direction. The group provides emotional safety. Agreement becomes a form of protection. The individual begins repeating the language of the crowd because disagreement threatens belonging. Inside these circles, groupthink quietly reshapes moral reasoning. Decisions are no longer evaluated individually but collectively. If the group justifies a behavior, the behavior becomes acceptable. Responsibility dissolves into shared consensus. The young man observing these dynamics may initially participate without questioning them. Participation offers security. It protects him from isolation. But over time, something begins to trouble him. He notices that the same conversations repeat themselves year after year without producing improvement. Anger circulates endlessly, yet conditions remain unchanged. Complaints multiply, yet solutions remain distant. This realization introduces a subtle form of discomfort known as conscious incompetence. The individual becomes aware that his current understanding of the world may be incomplete. He recognizes that repeating the same explanations has not improved his circumstances. The recognition is painful. Admitting that one's beliefs might be flawed feels like surrender. Pride resists such admissions. Narcissistic vulnerability makes the mind defensive. Instead of examining ideas calmly, the individual may react with irritation toward anyone who challenges familiar narratives. Yet awareness has already begun its work. William James argued that attention shapes experience. Whatever the mind chooses to observe becomes psychologically significant. Once the young man begins observing patterns rather than simply participating in them, his perception changes. He starts noticing the incentives behind behavior. He sees how admiration flows toward individuals who display confidence, even when their knowledge is shallow. He notices how outrage spreads faster than thoughtful discussion. He observes that many people prefer emotional certainty over complicated truth. This observation gradually weakens the attraction of the morality market described earlier. The individual begins recognizing that public approval is not always a reliable guide for ethical decisions. He also begins recognizing the role of vincible ignorance. Many individuals remain uninformed not because information is unavailable but because seeking it requires uncomfortable effort. Learning demands humility. It demands the willingness to admit previous errors. Scarcity often discourages this process because it compresses time horizons. When daily life requires constant attention to survival, reflection appears impractical. The mind gravitates toward quick answers rather than patient investigation. Yet the few individuals who resist this pressure slowly develop a different orientation toward life. Instead of repeating inherited narratives, they begin studying them. Instead of reacting immediately to every insult or disappointment, they examine the incentives producing those events. They begin recognizing how social stratification shapes opportunity, how institutions reward certain behaviors, and how historical patterns influence present conditions. This shift does not eliminate frustration. The structural challenges remain real. But the individual's relationship to those challenges changes. He begins seeing himself not merely as a victim of circumstance but as a participant within a complex system. That realization carries both burden and possibility. The burden lies in accepting responsibility for decisions that cannot always be blamed on external forces. The possibility lies in discovering that even within restrictive environments, certain choices remain available. Freud believed the human psyche constantly negotiates between instinct and restraint. Scarcity intensifies this negotiation, pushing instinct toward impatience and anger. But restraint becomes the tool through which long-term transformation begins. The young man gradually understands that the environment around him influences behavior, yet it does not completely determine it. He cannot immediately change the structure of the world. He cannot erase social stratification or economic decay through personal effort alone. But he can alter how he responds to those realities. He can refuse the simplicity of groupthink. He can resist the emotional momentum of herd mentality. He can pursue knowledge despite the discomfort it produces. These decisions may not produce instant success. In fact, they often produce isolation at first. Individuals who question dominant narratives sometimes appear disloyal to the group that once provided belonging. Yet over time a different form of belonging begins to emerge. It appears in conversations with mentors who value discipline over spectacle. It appears in books that challenge comfortable assumptions. It appears in moments of quiet reflection where the mind learns to observe itself honestly. Gradually, the morality market loses its authority. Approval from the crowd becomes less important than coherence within the self. The young man who once measured dignity through external respect begins measuring it through internal consistency. His values stop fluctuating according to the mood of the group. This transformation rarely occurs dramatically. It unfolds slowly, through repeated acts of attention and restraint. And once it begins, the individual realizes that the most decisive marketplace he must navigate is not the crowd's approval but the quiet negotiations taking place inside his own mind.
I keep asking who is safe, which heart is living land, while my lonely thoughts keep rooting like a hidden seed. When no one shares care or love, my wants turn wild and slant, and every silence feeds the hunger like a reckless seed.
Something wicked germinate like a buried seed. Now lust, suspicion, cravings, and defeat all branch through my chest, and I can feel my old compassion recede like a dying seed. The joy I had got stripped of cynicism, sarcasm, and self-absorption. I'm trying to read my ruin like cracked earth, searching for a seed.
This is a Scarcity production, an audiobook made for myself and others who share many of the same thoughts, beliefs, or opinions, promoting growth and appealing for profound change.
I've watched the world sort souls by flag and faith, like fate was drawn in slanted sand instead of planted seed. Some call it fairness while standing still in comfort, too afraid to touch the truth and name the bitter seed. I hear the silence bloom from fear, from shallow rooms and borrowed scripts, where thought grows faint and hearts receive.
Yeah, I moved through borders built before my name was spoken, where echo chambers chant like priests above a buried seed. They call me cynical for seeing the rigged design, but I seen self-denial dress as peace while whole lives bleed. What they refuse to face is this: groupthink keeps the garden neat, but only truth can break the concrete and free the seed.
So they shrink their side and trade their souls for safety, letting deeper thought recede. I'm trying to decipher humanity before my own heart hardens into stone and forgets the need for seed.
Chapter 4. Identity, Fracture, and the Search for Ground. In a city like London, the forces described earlier become visible in human form. The streets contain thousands of stories unfolding simultaneously. Wealth and scarcity live within walking distance of each other. Ambition and exhaustion share the same buses, the same schools, the same crowded neighborhoods. Among these stories are two young men whose lives appear different yet quietly echo the same struggle. The first youth carries a foreign background. His parents arrived in London years earlier searching for opportunity. They brought language, traditions, and memories from another place. At home, he hears one set of expectations, one understanding of history, one narrative about who he is supposed to become. Outside the home, the environment tells him something different. Schoolmates question his accent or his name. Employers hesitate when reading his background. Social media exposes him to endless comparisons between cultures, nations, and identities. Slowly he begins feeling divided between worlds. He wonders which identity truly belongs to him. Over time, this tension can develop into what psychologists describe as internalized oppression. The young man begins absorbing negative stereotypes circulating around him. He may start doubting his own cultural background while simultaneously feeling excluded from the dominant culture surrounding him. This contradiction creates deep identity conflict. Erik Erikson wrote that the formation of identity requires coherence between personal narrative and social recognition. When society sends mixed signals, the young person struggles to construct that coherence. The youth from a foreign background may feel pressure to prove himself constantly. Every failure appears to confirm the suspicions he fears others already hold. He becomes intensely aware of perception. The second youth grows up in the same city but under different circumstances. He is ethnically European, born in London, yet his environment is defined by poverty, uncertainty, and unstable opportunity. His family has lived in the city for generations, but that heritage offers little protection against economic decline. Factories have closed. Secure employment has faded. Rent consumes most of the household income. From an early age, he watches adults around him struggle to maintain stability. Arguments about money become common. Promises about future success feel distant and abstract. Unlike the first youth, his identity conflict is not cultural but economic. He does not question where he belongs geographically, but he questions where he belongs socially. The city around him contains immense wealth, yet that wealth feels unreachable. The contrast produces a quiet resentment. Both young men carry different burdens, yet their internal experiences begin to resemble each other. The youth with the foreign background wonders whether society will ever fully accept him. The youth raised in poverty wonders whether society will ever respect him. Both questions revolve around dignity. Inside their respective social circles, they encounter the same forces described earlier. Peer groups offer belonging but also encourage herd mentality. Echo chamber participant conversations circulate simplified explanations about the causes of their frustration. One narrative may blame cultural exclusion. Another may blame economic abandonment. Both narratives contain elements of truth, yet both can also trap individuals within cycles of resentment if left unexamined. Freud would describe these reactions as psychological defenses protecting the ego from humiliation. Anger becomes easier than vulnerability. Certainty becomes easier than reflection. Yet their lives intersect in subtle ways. They attend similar schools, travel through the same transport systems, and observe the same city skyline rising above neighborhoods where opportunity feels scarce. Each sees people who appear confident and successful, yet neither feels certain about the path that leads there. The youth from a foreign background studies language carefully, hoping that mastering it will erase the invisible barrier separating him from acceptance. The youth born into poverty studies status within his neighborhood, learning how reputation functions as currency when money is limited. Their strategies differ, but their motivations share the same origin. Both are searching for stability within a world that feels fragmented. The first youth struggles with identity fragmentation, trying to reconcile heritage with belonging. The second youth struggles with economic displacement, trying to reconcile ambition with limited opportunity. Both experience the psychological pressure of social stratification. They notice that the city divides people into layers defined by wealth, education, accent, and network. These divisions influence how strangers treat them, how institutions respond to them, and how they imagine their own future. Within these pressures, another danger appears. Both young men may encounter narratives encouraging them to interpret their lives entirely through grievance. The youth with a foreign background may be told that society will always reject him. The youth raised in poverty may be told that the system is permanently rigged against him. These narratives offer emotional relief because they simplify complex realities. But they also risk producing cognitive stagnation, where frustration replaces exploration. William James warned that beliefs shape the energy people bring to life. If a man believes improvement is impossible, he stops searching for pathways that might prove otherwise. Yet the lives of these two youths also contain another possibility. Their shared exposure to scarcity, whether cultural or economic, gives them a certain awareness that comfort rarely produces. They notice contradictions others ignore. They see how power, identity, and opportunity interact within the same city. This awareness can lead toward resentment, or it can lead toward understanding. The difference lies in whether they remain trapped inside echo chambers repeating inherited explanations, or whether they begin examining those explanations critically. For both young men, the challenge is the same. They must decide whether their identity will be constructed primarily through reaction to injustice, or through deliberate cultivation of character within an imperfect world. That decision will determine whether scarcity becomes their permanent identity, or merely the environment from which their story began. The psychological tension carried by these two young men, one wrestling with cultural identity, the other with economic humiliation, does not always express itself in constructive ways. When frustration remains unresolved and interpretation becomes distorted, the mind can drift toward darker conclusions about the world and one's place within it. History provides disturbing illustrations of how wounded identity, narcissistic vulnerability, and social alienation can combine with distorted thinking. Consider Elliot Rodger, the young man who carried out the killings in Isla Vista, California, in 2014. Rodger was not raised in extreme poverty. In fact, he lived in a relatively comfortable environment. Yet internally he experienced a profound sense of humiliation and rejection. His writings revealed a mind consumed by comparison and resentment. He measured his worth through external validation, especially attention and admiration from others. When that validation failed to appear, he interpreted the absence not as a complex social reality but as a personal injustice inflicted by the world. Rodger's psychology reflected severe narcissistic vulnerability. He felt entitled to admiration yet believed society had denied him the recognition he deserved. Over time, his resentment intensified inside an echo chamber of his own thoughts and online communities where similar frustrations circulated. The repetition of grievance hardened into certainty. Eventually, he came to believe that violence could restore the dignity he felt had been stolen. Another example appears in the life of Edmund Kemper, active in California during the early 1970s. Kemper's childhood environment was filled with conflict, humiliation, and emotional instability. His relationship with authority figures, especially within his family, was deeply fractured. From a young age, he internalized a sense of rejection and alienation. Kemper possessed high intelligence, yet intelligence alone did not provide moral stability. His internal world became dominated by anger and distorted fantasies about power and control. Instead of resolving humiliation through reflection or social support, he converted humiliation into aggression. Violence became a twisted attempt to reclaim psychological authority. Then there is Ted Bundy, whose crimes during the 1970s shocked much of the world. Bundy's case illustrates another dimension of identity conflict. Outwardly, he appeared confident, educated, and socially capable. Beneath that surface, however, investigators later described a personality marked by manipulation, entitlement, and emotional detachment. Bundy's life reveals how charm and intelligence can conceal deep psychological fractures. His ability to perform normality allowed him to move through society unnoticed for years. Yet internally he cultivated fantasies that dehumanized others, transforming people into objects serving his distorted sense of power. These examples are extreme, and most individuals experiencing frustration or identity conflict never approach such destructive outcomes. But the cases illustrate how the human mind can become dangerously distorted when humiliation, resentment, and isolation combine without guidance or correction. In each of these cases, a common psychological thread appears. First, there was a strong sense of grievance. Each individual believed the world had treated him unfairly. Second, there was an absence of healthy correction from social environments capable of challenging those beliefs. Third, there was cognitive stagnation, an unwillingness to question personal narratives even when evidence contradicted them. The mind gradually constructed a closed system of explanation. Within that system, every disappointment confirmed the same story, that others were responsible for their suffering. Invincible ignorance expanded because new information threatening that narrative was rejected. This process is not limited to extreme cases. Smaller versions appear in everyday life when individuals interpret every failure as evidence of betrayal or conspiracy. Over time, resentment begins shaping perception itself. The youth from a foreign background living in London may feel rejected and begin believing society will always see him as an outsider. The youth raised in poverty may conclude that dignity and success belong only to others. If these beliefs remain unchallenged, they can quietly reshape identity. The danger lies not only in anger but in the gradual narrowing of perspective. When a person stops examining his assumptions, the mind becomes a closed chamber where the same thoughts circulate endlessly. William James warned that attention determines the direction of consciousness. If a person continually focuses on insult, rejection, and injustice, those experiences become the center of psychological gravity. But awareness can interrupt this process. The stories of figures like Roger, Kemper, and Bundy demonstrate what happens when grievance evolves without reflection or restraint. Their lives illustrate the extreme endpoint of distorted identity, where humiliation transforms into destructive obsession. For the two young men walking the streets of London, the lesson is not simply fear of such outcomes. The deeper lesson concerns the importance of intellectual humility and moral discipline. Resentment may feel justified in moments of pain, but if resentment becomes the foundation of identity, it begins reshaping the entire moral landscape of the mind. And once the mind begins interpreting the world solely through grievance, it slowly loses the ability to recognize the pathways that still remain open. The pressures shaping identity and morality are not limited to Western cities like London. Similar dynamics appear across the world whenever fear, scarcity, and uncertainty collide. A revealing example emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic in India, a country located in South Asia on the Asian continent. During the early months of the pandemic, the government of India imposed a strict nationwide lockdown beginning on March 24, 2020, restricting movement across a population of more than 1.3 billion people. Cities such as New Delhi, Mumbai, and Jaipur suddenly became quieter, yet beneath the silence anxiety spread quickly. Jobs disappeared overnight, migrant laborers lost income, and many families struggled to secure food and transportation. Reports during that period described how fear of infection and social suspicion began influencing behavior in disturbing ways. Individuals who were suspected of carrying the virus sometimes faced hostility or violence from neighbors. Medical workers, men and women whose profession involved treating infected patients, were occasionally harassed or attacked because people feared they might spread the disease. The pattern revealed something deeper than panic. It exposed how fragile social trust can become during moments of collective uncertainty. Imagine a young man in New Delhi, living in a crowded neighborhood where employment suddenly disappears because businesses close during the lockdown. He watches migrant laborers walking hundreds of kilometers back to their villages after losing work. The streets carry rumors about infection, government policies, and conspiracies spreading rapidly through social media. In the same environment, a young woman working as a nurse returns home after long hospital shifts. Instead of being welcomed, she encounters suspicion. Some neighbors treat her as a potential threat rather than a caregiver. These interactions reveal the darker side of herd mentality. Fear compresses judgment. Instead of examining evidence carefully, communities sometimes search for visible targets onto whom they can project anxiety. In moments like this, ordinary people, men and women alike, can become symbols within larger narratives about danger and blame. The young man observing these events absorbs a powerful lesson about social behavior. He sees how quickly a community can shift from cooperation to suspicion. He notices how rumors travel faster than verified information. In environments where stress accumulates, groupthink becomes tempting. Accepting the crowd's interpretation requires less mental effort than questioning it. When a rumor spreads that a particular person or group carries danger, the collective instinct is to react first and investigate later. This pattern has appeared repeatedly in history, not only during pandemics but also during periods of economic collapse or political instability. The underlying mechanism is always similar: uncertainty increases fear, fear encourages simplified explanations, and simplified explanations produce scapegoats. The Indian lockdown illustrates how scarcity and anxiety can reshape moral perception even in densely populated cities with complex cultures and traditions. During the lockdown, thousands of migrant workers, mostly men, lost employment in urban areas and attempted to travel back to rural regions, creating one of the largest internal migrations in modern history. For many young people watching these events unfold, the psychological impact was profound. They witnessed how quickly social order could shift when economic stability vanished. Trust became fragile. Rumors replaced careful reasoning. The two youths walking through London described earlier could observe this story from across continents and still recognize its familiar structure. The young man with a foreign background might see parallels between the suspicion faced by migrants in India and the suspicion he sometimes feels in London. The youth raised in poverty might recognize how quickly economic collapse can push ordinary people into desperate choices. Different cities, different cultures, yet the same human tension appears. When societies experience crisis, whether a pandemic in Asia, economic decline in Europe, or political instability elsewhere, the underlying psychological patterns remain remarkably similar. Fear magnifies division. Identity becomes defensive. Communities search for explanations that restore a sense of control. But these moments also reveal another truth. They show how essential moral clarity becomes during crisis. When fear spreads, individuals capable of independent thinking become crucial. They resist the temptation of herd mentality. They question rumors. They recognize that panic can transform neighbors into enemies if reflection disappears. For the young men navigating identity and scarcity in London, stories from distant places like India serve as reminders that the struggle to preserve dignity and reason is universal. Scarcity may wear different faces across continents, but the challenge it presents to the human mind remains the same, whether fear will narrow perception or whether awareness will expand it.
I've watched the world sort souls by flag and faith, like fate was drawn in slanted sand instead of planted seed. Some call it fairness while standing still in comfort, too afraid to touch the truth and name the bitter seed. I hear the silence bloom from fear, from shallow rooms and borrowed scripts, where thought grows faint and hearts receive.
Yeah, I moved through borders built before my name was spoken, where echo chambers chant like priests above a buried seed. They call me cynical for seeing the rigged design, but I seen self-denial dress as peace while whole lives bleed. What they refuse to face is this: groupthink keeps the garden neat, but only truth can break the concrete and free the seed.
So they shrink their side and trade their souls for safety, letting deeper thought recede. I'm trying to decipher humanity before my own heart hardens into stone and forgets the need for seed.
This is a Ability production, an audiobook made for myself and others who share many of the same thoughts, beliefs, or opinions, promoting growth and appealing for profound change.
I keep asking who is safe, which heart is living land, while my lonely thoughts keep rooting like a hidden seed. When no one shares care or love, my wants turn wild and slant, and every silence feeds the hunger like a reckless seed. I miss the warmth that helped me bloom. Now I drift like dust in sand, afraid my need for touch will go into a darker sea.
I wanted love, approval, a place to stand but neglect. Let something wicked germinate like a buried seed. Now love, suspicion, cravings, and defeat all branch through my chest, and I can feel my old compassion recede like a dying seed. The joy I had got stripped of cynicism, sarcasm, and self-absorption. I'm trying to read my ruin like cracked earth, searching for a seed.
Again from broken land.
Chapter 5: Identity, Narrative, and the Architecture of Survival. By the time a man reaches maturity, he is no longer shaped only by his environment. He is shaped by the story he tells himself about that environment. Two individuals can live under the same conditions of scarcity and emerge with entirely different moral frameworks. One becomes hardened, reactive, and distrustful. The other becomes disciplined, observant, and deliberate. The difference does not lie solely in opportunity. It lies in interpretation. The mind is not only a receiver of experience. It is also an architect. Every experience, humiliation, rejection, struggle, small victories, becomes material for a narrative. That narrative gradually forms identity. And once identity stabilizes, behavior begins to follow its logic. This is where the earlier tensions converge. The young man shaped by scarcity carries memories of instability, exposure to social stratification, encounters with groupthink, and moments of conscious incompetence. He has witnessed both fairness and contradiction. He has felt both ambition and doubt. Now he must decide what these experiences mean. Some individuals construct identities rooted in grievance. They interpret every difficulty as evidence of a hostile system. Over time, this interpretation can evolve into vulnerable narcissism, where the individual feels perpetually misunderstood and undervalued. His self-worth depends on recognition, yet he believes recognition is constantly denied. This creates a fragile psychological state. Pride becomes defensive. Criticism becomes intolerable. The individual oscillates between self-doubt and quiet resentment. In more extreme cases, grievance hardens into something more dangerous. When the need for recognition combines with a desire for control, it can develop into malignant narcissism. Here, the individual no longer seeks validation alone. He seeks dominance. He begins viewing others not as equals, but as instruments or obstacles. Empathy weakens. Moral boundaries blur. This transformation does not occur suddenly. It develops through repeated reinforcement of distorted narratives. Echo chambers amplify these narratives until they appear unquestionable. The individual may even adopt the posture of a delusional authority figure, believing his personal interpretation of the world is superior to all others. He positions himself as someone who sees truth while others remain blind. This belief provides psychological comfort because it restores a sense of power in an otherwise uncertain life. Yet it isolates him further from reality. On the opposite side of this spectrum lies a quieter distortion. Some individuals respond to scarcity by overcompensating through what can be described as narcissistic generosity. They give excessively, not from genuine abundance, but from a need to be seen as valuable. Their identity depends on external approval. They become useful to others while neglecting their own stability. This behavior appears positive on the surface, but often leads to exhaustion and hidden resentment. The individual sacrifices himself for validation, then feels overlooked when recognition fades. Both patterns, dominance and overgiving, share the same root. They are attempts to resolve internal instability through external control, but neither provides lasting stability. The deeper challenge lies in confronting status quo bias, the tendency to remain within familiar patterns even when those patterns produce dissatisfaction. Many individuals shaped by scarcity continue repeating behaviors learned in their early environment because those behaviors feel psychologically safe. Even destructive habits can feel familiar. Breaking this cycle requires deliberate awareness. It requires the ability to observe one's own narrative critically rather than accepting it automatically. René Descartes emphasized the importance of questioning assumptions. Applied to identity, this means asking uncomfortable questions. Which beliefs about myself are based on evidence, and which are based on fear? Which narratives have I inherited without examination? William James suggested that human beings possess the capacity to choose which thoughts they reinforce. This does not mean ignoring reality, but it means refusing to let a single narrative dominate perception. For the man shaped by scarcity, this becomes the turning point. He begins recognizing that identity is not fixed. It is constructed through repeated interpretation. The same experiences that once produced resentment can also produce understanding if examined differently. He acknowledges the reality of economic pressure, social stratification, and inequality. But he refuses to allow these realities to define the limits of his thinking. This shift does not eliminate difficulty. Scarcity remains a force influencing behavior. The world does not suddenly become fair, but the individual gains something equally important. He gains internal coherence. Instead of reacting impulsively to every external pressure, he begins acting according to a chosen framework. His decisions become less dependent on group approval and more aligned with long-term intention. He understands that the mind can be shaped by environment, yet it can also reshape how that environment is experienced. This is the architecture of survival. It is not built through denial of hardship, nor through blind optimism. It is built through disciplined interpretation, where awareness replaces reaction and understanding replaces assumption. The child of scarcity does not escape his origins, but he can decide whether those origins remain a prison or become a foundation upon which something more stable can be constructed. And in that decision lies the final distinction between those who are consumed by scarcity and those who learn, slowly and deliberately, how to move beyond it. Within this broader landscape of identity and moral construction, the question of immigration has become one of the most emotionally charged arenas where scarcity, perception, and power intersect. A far-right activist, in the context of immigration, is often an individual who interprets large-scale migration not primarily as a humanitarian or economic phenomenon, but as a threat to national identity, cultural continuity, and resource distribution. This perspective is rarely formed in isolation. It develops within environments where rapid demographic change, economic pressure, and political uncertainty converge. The activist begins framing migrants as competitors for jobs, housing, and social services, reinforcing a belief that the existing population is being displaced or neglected. Over time, this belief can evolve into a rigid worldview shaped by status quo bias, where preserving existing cultural and economic structures becomes more important than adapting to changing realities. The narrative becomes emotionally persuasive because it simplifies complex global movements into a struggle between insiders and outsiders. A detailed illustration of this tension can be seen in Europe's ongoing migration situation. A report from the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, describes how hundreds of thousands of migrants entered Europe in 2023, many fleeing war, poverty, and environmental crises, with over 385,000 irregular arrivals recorded that year alone. These movements are part of a larger pattern, with millions of immigrants arriving in Europe over the past decade, placing visible strain on housing systems, public services, and political institutions. For the two young men described earlier, this reality does not appear as statistics but as lived experience. The youth raised in poverty may observe increased competition for low-paying jobs and affordable housing. In his perception, opportunities already limited become even more scarce. His frustration does not necessarily originate from hatred, but from the feeling that his position in society is becoming more fragile. Within certain social circles, these observations are amplified and simplified until they form a clear narrative that migration is directly responsible for his stagnation. The youth with a foreign background experiences the same situation from the opposite side. He sees migrants arriving with the same hopes his own family once carried. Yet he also feels the tension in public discourse, where individuals who resemble him are discussed as problems rather than participants in society. This creates a deeper layer of identity conflict. He is both part of the society and, in some narratives, treated as external to it. These opposing perceptions feed into each other. As migration increases, support for stricter immigration policies and far-right political movements often rises alongside it, reflecting how quickly economic and cultural anxiety can transform into political identity. The environment becomes polarized. Each group begins reinforcing its own interpretation of reality, often through echo chambers that reward emotional certainty over careful reasoning. Within this polarization, individuals may adopt exaggerated roles. Some begin embodying a delusional authority figure, believing they possess unique insight into the truth about society while dismissing alternative perspectives entirely. Others retreat into vulnerable narcissism, feeling constantly targeted and misunderstood by forces beyond their control. In both cases, the ability to engage with complexity diminishes. The deeper issue, however, is not immigration alone. It is the interaction between large-scale social change and individual psychological stability. Migration exposes existing fractures within societies: economic inequality, identity insecurity, and institutional distrust. It does not create these fractures, but it magnifies them. For the young men navigating these realities, the challenge remains consistent with everything described throughout this work. They must decide whether their interpretation of these changes will be shaped by fear and simplified narratives, or by disciplined understanding. Whether they will adopt inherited reactions or construct their own framework for navigating a world that is undeniably shifting. Because in the end, immigration is not only a political issue. It is a mirror reflecting how individuals process uncertainty, difference, and the limits of their own identity. The lives of certain public figures reveal how identity, scarcity, and interpretation shape a man or woman far beyond their beginnings. Their stories are rarely linear. They move through contradiction, adaptation, reinvention, and collapse. What appears as success from a distance often hides unresolved tension beneath the surface. Consider Brigitte Bardot, born in Paris in 1934 into relative comfort, yet shaped by the rigid expectations of post-war society. She became an international symbol of beauty and freedom, but her later life reflected withdrawal, disillusionment, and increasingly controversial views about culture and identity. Her trajectory reveals that recognition does not guarantee internal stability. Fame amplified her voice, but it also exposed unresolved tensions about belonging and societal change. Coco Chanel, born into poverty in 1883 and raised in an orphanage after her mother's death, constructed herself from scarcity into one of the most influential figures in fashion. Her discipline, restraint, and attention to structure reflected a mind shaped by deprivation. Yet her life also carried moral ambiguity, particularly during wartime, where survival, ambition, and loyalty became difficult to separate. Chanel's story illustrates how scarcity can produce both brilliance and ethical compromise. Sonny Liston, born into extreme poverty in the American South, grew up surrounded by violence, instability, and illiteracy. His early life offered little guidance beyond survival. Boxing became his path to recognition, but his reputation remained entangled with fear and suspicion. Even as heavyweight champion, he carried the psychological imprint of his upbringing. His death in 1970, under uncertain circumstances, reflected a life that never fully escaped the gravity of its origins. Reuben "Hurricane" Carter experienced a different form of instability. Raised in poverty, he found direction through boxing, only to be later imprisoned for a crime he consistently denied committing. His life became a symbol of injustice within the legal system. Years of incarceration reshaped his identity, forcing him to confront both external injustice and internal transformation. His eventual release did not erase the years lost, but it revealed how resilience can coexist with profound suffering. Then there is Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little in 1925 into a family marked by racial violence and economic hardship. His father's death and his mother's institutionalization exposed him early to instability. He moved through crime, imprisonment, and eventually intellectual awakening. His transformation into Malcolm X represented one of the most striking examples of identity reconstruction. He rejected inherited narratives, rebuilt his thinking, and redefined his moral framework. Yet his life ended violently, reminding us that transformation does not shield individuals from the forces surrounding them. Yves Saint Laurent, born in Algeria in 1936 during French colonial rule, entered a world shaped by cultural tension and transition. He rose quickly in the fashion industry, displaying extraordinary creative vision. Yet his life was also marked by psychological fragility, addiction, and periods of withdrawal. His work reflected brilliance, but his internal world remained unstable, revealing how sensitivity and pressure can coexist within the same individual. These lives differ in context, culture, and outcome, yet they share a common structure. Each individual began within a specific environment, whether scarcity, privilege, conflict, or instability. Each encountered moments where identity became uncertain. Each constructed a narrative to navigate that uncertainty. And each revealed, in different ways, the tension between external success and internal coherence. Some responded to pressure by developing discipline and structure. Others responded through withdrawal, controversy, or self-destruction. In some cases, resilience produced transformation. In others, unresolved tension remained beneath the surface despite visible achievement. These stories reinforce a central truth. The environment provides the initial conditions, but it does not dictate the final form. What matters is how the individual interprets those conditions over time. Malcolm X transformed his identity through deliberate reflection and study. Chanel transformed scarcity into structure and influence. Carter transformed injustice into a platform for awareness. Yet Bardot, Liston, and Saint Laurent reveal how unresolved conflict can persist even when success appears complete. For the young men described earlier, these lives offer neither simple inspiration nor simple warning. They reveal complexity. They show that identity is not a fixed possession but an ongoing construction. That success without internal clarity can become unstable. That hardship can either harden resentment or deepen understanding. And most importantly, they demonstrate that the narrative a person builds about his own life will ultimately shape not only his decisions, but the meaning he assigns to everything he experiences. Because in the end, survival is not only about enduring conditions. It is about learning how to interpret them without losing oneself in the process.
I keep asking who is safe, which heart is living land, while my lonely thoughts keep rooting like a hidden seed. When no one shares care or love, my wants turn wild and slant, and every silence feeds the hunger like a reckless seed. The warmth that helped me bloom, now I drift like dust in sand. Afraid my need for touch will go into a darker sea.
I wanted love, approval, a place to stand but neglect. Let something wicked germinate like a buried seed. Now love, suspicion, cravings, and defeat all branch through my chest. And I can feel my old compassion recede like a dying seed. The joy I had got stripped of cynicism, sarcasm, and self-absorption. I'm trying to read my ruin like cracked earth, searching for a seed.
Epilogue. The story of scarcity is not only about economics. It is about pressure, slow, persistent, and often invisible. It presses on the mind, the body, and the way a man interprets himself and others. It reshapes time, making the future feel distant and the present feel urgent. It alters perception, turning ordinary interactions into tests of dignity. By now, the central truth has repeated itself in different forms. A man cannot easily think, act, or feel properly without a degree of financial independence. Without stability, the mind becomes reactive. Impulses grow stronger. Patience weakens. The distance between emotion and action shortens. This is not a moral failure. It is a condition. Economic decay, the collapse of traditional wealth-building pathways, and the commodification of labor, relationships, and movement have created an environment where survival often overshadows reflection. The consequences appear everywhere: rising loneliness, boredom, anxiety, and in some cases, criminal behavior. But beneath these visible outcomes lies something deeper: a fragmentation of identity. People divide themselves and others into categories, based on background, belief, education, ambition, language, and perception. These divisions become filters through which reality is interpreted. Dialogue becomes difficult because each group speaks from within its own narrative. The echoes grow louder. Insults linger longer. Mockery cuts deeper. Emotional suppression becomes routine. The individual carries not only personal struggles but also inherited insecurities, internalized doubt, and the pressure of societal expectations. This accumulation becomes heavy. It feels like an anchor dragging the mind downward into cycles of alienation, resentment, confusion, and helplessness. The individual begins questioning his value, his direction, and his place within the world. And yet, even within this weight, something remains intact. Awareness. Awareness is uncomfortable because it reveals contradiction. It forces the individual to confront both external limitations and internal patterns. It exposes the influence of herd mentality, the comfort of groupthink, and the danger of leaving one's narrative unexamined. But awareness also offers possibility. It allows the individual to step back, to observe the economy of his own mind, and to recognize that while he cannot control every condition around him, he can influence how those conditions are interpreted. This is not a promise of immediate escape from scarcity. It is a shift in orientation. Instead of being entirely shaped by the environment, the individual begins participating consciously in his own development. He questions inherited beliefs. He resists simplified narratives. He learns to separate emotional reaction from deliberate action. This process is slow. It requires discipline, humility, and a willingness to remain uncertain long enough to discover clearer understanding. It requires accepting that progress may not be visible immediately, and that dignity must sometimes be maintained without external recognition. But over time, something changes. The anchor becomes lighter. The noise of external pressure loses some of its authority. The individual begins constructing a more stable internal framework, one that does not collapse under every insult or disappointment. Scarcity may still exist, but it no longer defines the entire structure of the mind. Summary. This work has explored how power imbalance and economic decay shape the moral and psychological development of men. It began by examining the early formation of identity within environments marked by instability. The emotional economy of childhood, defined by attachment, stress, and exposure to scarcity, lays the foundation for later behavior. Chronic pressure builds allostatic load, influencing perception, judgment, and emotional regulation. From there, the inheritance of scarcity was explored. Families pass down not only financial conditions but also patterns of thought, expectation, and response. Social stratification shapes ambition, while limited opportunity creates tension between effort and reward. The morality market emerged as a central concept. When systems appear inconsistent or unfair, individuals begin adjusting their moral reasoning. Survival becomes the priority, and principles risk becoming conditional. Herd mentality and groupthink reinforce simplified narratives, while vincible ignorance and cognitive stagnation prevent deeper understanding. Through the lives of individuals and communities, whether in London, Germany, India, or beyond, the text illustrated how identity conflict, humiliation, and uncertainty interact. These forces can produce resilience or distortion depending on how they are interpreted. The final stage focused on identity construction. Concepts such as vulnerable narcissism, malignant narcissism, narcissistic generosity, and status quo bias revealed how individuals attempt to resolve internal instability through external validation or control. Some seek dominance. Others seek approval. Both responses reflect the same underlying tension. Across all chapters, a consistent theme emerged. Human behavior is shaped by environment, but not entirely determined by it. The individual retains the capacity to examine his own narrative, to question assumptions, and to develop a framework that allows for both awareness of reality and deliberate action within it. Scarcity influences thought. It pressures morality. It distorts perception. But it does not eliminate the possibility of clarity. The central challenge is not simply to escape scarcity, but to understand it deeply enough that it no longer governs the mind completely. And in that understanding, the individual begins to move, not perfectly, not easily, but deliberately, toward a life defined not only by conditions, but by conscious direction. This is ASC Ability Production, an audiobook made for myself and others who share many of the same thoughts, beliefs, or opinions, promoting growth and appealing for profound change.
It's cold out here, man. A true masterpiece of illusions, decay and collapse. I see you as a brother, you see me as a threat or a clown. Our bodies inflamed, our spirits weighed down. Toxins in our blood, metals in our bones. Minds clouded by brain fog, judgment gone. Is this what our ancestors prayed for? Holistic healing, a resurrection, a resurrection.
Listen close, make I yarn you this day. Two souls rise from family where they fail. Papa not delusional, I thought the figure they vex. Mama gaslighting, guardian cause stress. They preach false wisdom like gospel truth. We hustle mental health from our youth. Fixed mindset when no greed let us grow. Emotional vampire, they suck we flow.
Think plenty, mob mentality strong. If you think different, them say you did wrong. Financial illiteracy, they chain we down. Toxic friendships everywhere, smiles like clowns. But we too choose healing to break this chain. Leave generational trauma, no remain. Or leads to resurrection, that's our goal. Heal the mind, the body, the spirit, all.
Holistic healing, a resurrection, breaking cycles, new direction. Mind, body, spirit, true reflection. Holistic healing, a resurrection.
We come from roots deep in ancient soil. Before the noise, before synthetic spoil. A paleo wisdom carved in stone and flame. But now we dance to songs with no name. Medical maps show what we can't see. Oxidative stress, fractured identity. Music once healed, now it harms in disguise. Feeding our trauma while blinding our eyes. Auto-tune lies and glorified rage. No harmony left, just a digital cage. Beats that numb, not beats that man. We lost the message that used to transcend. You play it loud, but your soul feels hollow. The rhythm is sweet, but the truth's hard to swallow. We mimic, we follow, without introspection. Forgetting holistic healing, a resurrection.
How can you love when your heart's confused? How can you lead when your past's been used? Our minds once sharp, now buried in noise. Our children fed chaos, not wisdom or poise.
Afrobeat ain't just a dance, it's a memory of drummers, of healers, of ancestry. But commercialization stole our reflection. We must return holistic healing.
A resurrection, a resurrection, breaking cycles, new direction. Mind, body, spirit, true reflection. Holistic healing, a resurrection. See this life, we been here rough for we sow. We dey reap wetin we sow, we know. If we no do shadow work and introspect, this we go repeat, team no go respect. Financial wisdom, na medicine we need. Break from toxic bonds, we make heart bleed. Authenticity, na strength, fake love, na weak, na healing and truth where our spirit they see.
Our heart and mind, powerful instruments. Consume carefully, build strong foundations. From environmental stress, disrepair and pain. Choose positivity, CE, authenticity reclaim.
I dey wonder wetin elders been they think. No investment, no savings, they make we sink. Just shame and outdated beliefs, them pass down now. A burden, now we they wear the crown.
But true men, no they talk just to wound, they listen. Reflect, give others room, no dialogue thrives. For gossip direction, make we rise now. Holistic healing, our resurrection.
A resurrection, breaking cycles, new direction. Mind, body, spirit, true reflection. Holistic healing, a resurrection. Holistic healing, a resurrection. Breaking cycles, new direction. Mind, body, spirit, true reflection. Holistic healing, a resurrection.
can't name this feeling. Smoke in a locked room, alarms with no exit. Emptiness, cravings, hostile thoughts, and occupied chest. Call it a misfire reflex, amygdala sirens, prefrontal on mute. Default mode loops graffiti my skull while prediction errors harvest my doubt. You fear what I might be, I fear what I might become. I sit before a future that already dislikes my resume. Culture speaks in keys I wasn't taught. My mouth swaps dialects like counterfeit cash. Behind me, distorted amnesia. Inside me, internalized depression doing long division. Marion whispers, it's not our darkness, it's our light that scares us. So I crack the window and let the blaze interrogate the room. I'm mnemonic, lower the shoulders. Inhale 478, ground to 5, honor history, train the prefrontal. Elephant in the room, it's me, unshrunk. I've glitched in public and private. Hallways, timelines, mirrors. Urges stampede my cortex, dopamine rights. IOUs, my soul won't cash. They sold me a spine made of likes. I returned it for store credit. Her mentality moves like weather. Algorithms bottle outrage and call it purpose. My levers went silent, so I learned new wiring. Extinction learning for old triggers. Hippocampus violent truth where rumor used to sit. Salience network retuned, so my worth is in the fire alarm. EM check, I drew a line in the sand, then paved it. I won't wear a costume for comfort. I won't burn down the house to warm a room. Mnemonic, glow. Grateful, discipline, limit bait. Operate slow, work the boring miracles. Prisoners of war claim morning. Unlock the mouth of the sun. Child of God. Stop shrinking. Smallness never saved anyone. Mirror neurons catch the blaze. When I shine, permission multiply. Power beyond. Measure, I breathe it in. And fear vaporizes. 2 passports, no homeland. Native of no man's land. Parents packed hunger in suitcases. I pack questions they can't stand. They can fly home to reset. I'm born in the bullseye, no reset. Guest in the house, my cradle tax. Smile for the asset subset. Check out lanes, hums, xenophobia, scanner, sing my surname twice. Microcuts with macro laws, polished steel behind the ice. Just toughen up, they preach I've chewed gravel since the pram. Identity's not a phase, it's a fire code. I live with siren jam. I won't chant for cameras, plastic flags melting the glare. Give me contracts over costumes, clean ledgers over flair. If gratitude means silence, miss me. If gangster is the syllabus, withdraw me. I love us enough to break the cycles, not the windows. Watch me. Count the cost, how much blood buys shelter, how much soul buys a visa. Your return flight steady, Jew, my runway is amnesia. Call me minority, fine, I answer. Major warning on arrival, I'm raising sons of clarity in a city allergic to survival. I keep receipts of refusal, I won't clap on cue, won't kneel for a fitting. If normal means erasure, I'll take code over coma. Pile of vagal reset, neck soft, breath low, locus coeruleus off patrol. Synaptic pruning of shame, myelination of courage, practice till it's fluent. I audit myself with my arithmetic now. At mercy, multiply skill, divide noise, carry none. Idioms flip the straw that broke the camel. I weave it in to rope the chips on my shoulder, sand them into handles for the next one climbing. Prisoners of war claim morning. Unlock the mouth of the sun. Child of God. Stop shrinking, smallness never saved anyone. Mirror neurons catch the blaze. When I shine, finesse and multiplies. Power beyond. Measure, I breathe it in. And fear vaporizes. I was a warning wrapped in a body. Now I'm a lighthouse with receipts. Oxytocin warms the room. Cortisol bows out. Amygdala and PFC sign a truce. We were born to manifest. Plural, bright, unborrowed. I walk with my emptiness like a pharaoh prayer till it learns my name. And when the lock remembers it's a hinge, the morning salutes, and others rise without asking.